I've broken this board up into 4 areas. I don't know if you can see it way in the back there, but civil unrest, terrorism, crime, and then I left this one blank intentionally. I have something to put in there, but I didn't want it sitting up there because what I'm going to put down will be a little confusing at first, and that is martyrdom. Obviously, I've not experienced that personally, but I have a friend that was martyred, and had to get very involved in the situation. What I want to do is, we as a family, in one way or the other, and the team, have had to walk through each of these situations at one time or another. And what I'd like to do is just share a little bit of the story of each of the different scenarios that we walked through. And then what I want us to do is pull out what are the different types of characteristics that are present in each one of these. Because once we understand the characteristics of different types of scenarios, that kind of helps us understand where is the best help from the home front. Because one security crisis is not the same as another security crisis. And so how do we now work from there? So I want us to, together, collectively, pull the stories apart, identify some characteristics, and then from there talk through how do we from the home front be able to deal with this. And I will keep my eye on the clock as much as possible, and therefore I'll try to keep the stories. I'm a storyteller, so it gets a little tough. And time, I lived in Africa long enough. It's starting to become relevant again, but it's still second, not first nature. So I'll do my best, but I just want to walk through each story, and then we'll come back and kind of pull them apart. Does that sound like an okay way to go? Okay. So if we look at the issue of civil unrest, we had a situation. It's 2007, 2008, but it was literally the last day of 2007. So it was New Year's. 2007. We had just finished our election cycle for presidential election, parliament, all the things that go on in Kenya. And the previous election in 2002 was a very peaceful transfer of power. It was the first official transfer of power from one president and one party to another. The previous party had ruled the country for the better part of 50 years, and so it was the first peaceful transfer, and at that point, it really marks, like, okay, it's a new day in Kenya. Well, now just 5 years later, we had another election. It happens that the Lord sometimes put me in some little unusual situations. I was friends with one of the presidential candidates. It was actually in the middle of the previous 2002 cycle that, through some unusual situations, too many details to get into here, the Lord brought me into a relationship with him in 2002. He became a presidential candidate in 2007, but he was not the winning candidate. There were three primary candidates, and the one that was the incumbent and another opposition, they're razor thin difference. My friend was in third place. The reality is he was the only Christian that was standing. Had the church stood, it probably would have been a landslide, but there was a lot of tribalism that came into the election very deeply. And immediately after the election, while the results were being weighted, the tension started to boil in the country. And as all of a sudden the election was declared to go to the incumbent, and immediately things blew up. And that night, in different parts of the country, all of a sudden, there was the only way we can describe what happened in those 2 months, because there was 2 months of chaos that ensued, it was like the gates of hell literally opened up and went unrestrained for the next 2 months. It was where Kenya was always known as the bastion of peace in Africa. It was the point of stability for East Central Africa. It was the haven. And now all of a sudden, it was just like literally unhinged. And what we saw during that time was we saw all of a sudden everything that had been known to be normal was no longer normal. So I remember even we were sitting with our Kenyan neighbors. Well, we had to hunker down. All of a sudden, we'd come back from vacation, Christmas vacation, the day before the election. I told Nancy I didn't want to be out when the election happens. We had no idea what was going to ensue, but we wanted to be home, for the election. We didn't want, but we had just gotten home. Hadn't even had time to go out and shop. We'd been gone for a week plus, and all of a sudden we had chaos everywhere. You couldn't even go out. You couldn't go shopping. So we just had to hunker down. And we were sitting with Kenyan friends and our neighbors, and we just decided to have a barbecue together and just kind of wait the thing out. And we all assumed, because we're used to minor flashes of civil unrest. That was just normal. A little riot happens here, and a little riot happens there. We were very used to those happening and kind of avoiding them, and it was just kind of the part of life. But we figured, okay, at worst, this thing's going to go 3 days. But it carried on 2 months. And in the middle of that, we started seeing neighbor killing neighbor. We saw tribe against tribe. We saw absolute, a church up in the town of Eldoret, 35 people were locked into it and burnt alive. I went up there 9 days after the fact with about 26 bishops and senior pastors from Nairobi, flew up on a DC-3, stood on the ashes of that church 9 days after it happened. I later met the senior pastor of that church. It was a senior pastor, you don't get to think of Calvary Lutheran Church. It was a very small church. But I met him in Nairobi, and he shared the story of how he was left dead on the scene. They'd actually thrown grass on him. He was unconscious, and tried lighting him on fire, as they had with many others. The fire didn't take. He, of course, survived and told the story. So much more I won't tell because it's absolutely horrific. My wife to this day has not allowed me to tell her the whole story. And it was just symbolic of what was happening. But through the whole time, we were supposed to have been receiving a group of interns from Bethany that were supposed to have been arriving 10 days after the New Year. So we then began working with the home office, trying to make decisions. We deferred by a month, and we thought, okay, a month from now, hopefully things are going to settle down. A month later, we deferred another month. And then we actually did take them, but I was able to get them into Tanzania, where things were safe. They could start language learning and everything, and then, we let the country settle. But in the middle of all that time, every day was a different day. And it was, what we depended on was information. Because I remember one day when the media was completely blacked out. There was no live broadcast allowed. You could have other stuff broadcasting, but no live broadcast was permitted for a day. And in the middle of that, my wife's sister was visiting, and she was there at the outset of stuff, and we had to get her to, she was supposed to be flying out on that particular day. And we had no idea what roads were open between our house and the airport, and could I even get there? There were rumors of martial law being, put in. What couldn't we do? So I was calling around like crazy, and it was so early into the crisis. That was only 3 days in. I couldn't get enough information to know if I could even get to the airport. And so finally, I just said to her, one, I'm going to take you, because we tried saying, okay, let's delay your flight a few days and let this blow over, and the next flight available was 6 weeks out. Because a whole lot of people have known we're trying to leave. And I said, I'm going to try and take you there. So we left and got to downtown Nairobi, which I had to go through to get to the airport, and it was completely barricaded, with the special forces blocking it off. They were diverting people up a hill, but I didn't know now could I get around to make connections to get to the airport. Under normal circumstances, I could, but who knows if enough roads were connecting. So I pulled over, went out and talked to this guy with full bulletproof vests and flak jackets and helmets and assault rifles and everything else. And it happened as I pulled over, so did another vehicle, and he was from Kenya. He was in a Kenya Airways uniform, also going to the airport. So I said to him, we're trying to get to the airport. Is there a way through? where we can get there. And he says, you're both going to the airport, I assume. And he goes, yeah. He goes, okay, I'm going to open up this checkpoint, let you through, but I have no idea what's going to happen at the next checkpoint. And so we drove through downtown Nairobi. Everything is empty, completely empty. And we drove together through there. And as we got to the big park that's off downtown Nairobi, it was completely shoulder to shoulder surrounded by special forces. And then we went on, managed to get her to the airport. She got out, I got home before dark. But it was that piece of information. Now, in the middle of the crisis, this is what we learned. Information is absolutely invaluable. And so as time went and the crisis continued, I began putting together kind of my information sources. And then I also became information source for others. And because I had a friend who, of course, was one of the presidential candidates, I was in the middle of all the mix of everything. His personal assistant I knew as well, so I did call him. I had a friend who was a TV reporter, so I would talk to him. I had a friend that was a Kenyan that worked at the U.S. Embassy in the security intelligence area. I could talk to him, and sometimes he was in the middle of riots, and I was getting first-hand reports from him. And I had other friends did every place. Another friend that lived in a slum where a lot of violence took place. And so able to kind of figure out how do we get the information to go. And I literally was spending, and phone usage at that point is pretty expensive in Kenya. It's pretty cheap now, but then I was spending probably $25 a day just on telephone usage. Just in gathering information and passing information in order to know, okay, can we go shopping or can't we go shopping? Can we do? And through all that, we had our contingencies in place to know, okay, what would be the thing that's going to cause us to know, okay, we got to get out of the country. But we really felt in that situation, the situation was not about us. There was nothing anti-West. There was nothing anti-Christian. There was nothing about us. It was, so we weren't any direct threat. So we just realized if we hunker down, keep information, know what's going on, we'll ride it through. Our home office, we kept in very, very close touch throughout the whole situation, and so that the question was always there. Okay, how are things now? Is there a need to move out, or is there not? And so we had kind of worked around together. What would it be? Nice thing in the situation is, it was only we were the only Bethany people on the ground at that point in time, so I wasn't responsible for anybody else. Yes, I was only responsible for my wife and kids. The interns that, fortunately, they weren't in the country yet. Others, so it made it much more simple in a sense. But literally, it was a time of seeing the gates of hell literally opened up in a way that was just unspeakable. But it was, so that's a massive civil unrest dynamic. Okay, and we went through that. So now we move forward to. Where's my markers? Here they are. We move forward to 2011, October. And, country had kind of gotten back to normal somewhat. There's a whole lot of post-trauma stuff in the country following. There's a lot of issues that had to be kind of sorted through. By 2011, kind of felt like the country had gotten back to normal. And, people were trying to work on tribalism issues, and, there's a lot of stuff coming up. But all of a sudden, we started getting from the Somali terrorism group Al-Shabaab, started sending some incursions across the border. They'd done some kidnappings of foreigners up in the far north coast of tourism, and then in the terrorism camp, refugee camp near the Somali border. They kidnapped 2 doctors out of there. And at that point, the Kenya government made a decision with their military that they'd never done before. They sent their military across the border in offensive action. And in 49 years of the country being an independent country, Kenya's military was at one point number 7 in the world for providing forces for UN peacekeeping. But they'd never been in hostile offensive action. And with no warning whatsoever, they sent the military into Somalia. Now, what had changed for us from 2007 to 2011 is now we're there, we were just one family, having to worry about ourselves. And there were friends and others we were working with. 2011, we now had a family, up based towards the Somali border, and they had interns. And those interns, this was actually at this point would have been the fourth group of interns. In that time, we had a group of those interns that came in 2008, we had one in 2009, 2010, 2011, that group, the fourth group now. So we were a lot of cycles of running interns, and we had people up there full-time. It's a fully Muslim area near the Somali border. It's the last town before that, the big refugee camp, which is right before the border. And those interns had only been up there for 5 days, as I mentioned earlier. And so I'm watching news Sunday evening when I find out that all of a sudden the Kenyan military has crossed the border into Somalia. And there's naturally going to be some sort of reaction. And there's only certain spots within Kenya that reaction was likely to come, and one of them was right there where we had our people and our interns that had been there for all of 5 days. So I looked at my wife and I said, I've got to go to Grissa tomorrow. And she says, yeah, of course you do. So next day I drive up to Grissa. I'm going the same direction as all the military convoys. They had a big military base there. That was one of the forward base of operation. So I get there and meet with Jason, our leader up there, and spend time with him and another leader we had, and then with the interns, and gathered all the interns and just said, you know what? One of the great things about the Bethany program is that you're not in the classroom, you're out in real life. So one of the aspects about being in real life is we don't know what's going to come. And I said, what has just happened here has never happened in Kenya's history. And we happen to be right in the spot where it's happening, or right near. So I said, I laid everything out for them, and I said, we're going to work and assess, and we're going to keep you informed. Right now, we're not going to move you, but you all have to be ready in the event that we do. And in the event that we do have to move you, no questions asked. Just when we get to the other end, you can ask all the questions you want. But, so I spent a few days there with Jason. We spent time figuring out who the security apparatus was, got to know the head of the anti-terror unit up there, got to know who actually became a very close friend along the way, made, talking to the grassroots people. Again, found what are our sources of information. Because what we realize is, again, information becomes the basis for decision. And in the middle of the crisis, if you're making the decision off of emotion, you're not making a good decision. And so, again, we went through a variety of sources, and we went and talked to a lot of people, gathered information, and then we had to assess, well, all that information, how much of what we were getting was actual information and how much was opinion. So that we could try to make sense of what we were gathering, and then put together, okay, what's our triggers? What are the things that would cause us to have to pull out of here? Yeah. And I got back to Nairobi, and it was only 2 days later that the U.S. Embassy sent out a security warning. And honestly, I listen, I hear the U.S. Embassy warnings, but their thresholds are like at a whole different level than what ours are. I mean, so we typically listen to them, but we don't say, when they say go, we don't necessarily think it's necessarily time to go. It's part of an equation of a whole other pieces of information. But this one was unusual in that it came out on a Saturday afternoon, and it said, you referenced imminent threat. And so I called one of my sources in the security anti-terror unit that I'd gotten to know, and I said, what's up here? Is this a legitimate? And he goes, yeah. He goes, it's legitimate. He goes, we don't know what, but there's rumors that there have been released, X number of suicide bombers into the country that have just crossed the border. We can't guarantee anything, but it is, as far as we know, a legitimate threat. So with that, we are assessing, and of course that word imminent, put that into the news cycle over here in the U.S. So now we've got these students that have been they're a week and a half there, and now their parents are hearing about imminent attacks in Kenya, and they're listing where they actually are as one of the places that are concerned. So of course we were on, Jason, the leader up there, myself, and the team back here were in constant conversation. And as Jason and I were going, we made an agreement, and we worked out triggers, but we also had an agreement that if a decision to move was made, that we agreed that I'd have to make the decision. And he said, because if the decision to go will be too hard because I'm in the middle of it. And I know it'll be uprooted in my family, and I know it'll be moving, and I don't know when I'll come back. And so we had an agreement already made up as to how the decision could be made and by who. And so that next night, like we got off the phone, and it was literally about 2 or 3 hours later, an attack happened in Nairobi. It was a small attack, but it was a grenade attack, one into a small nightclub or a small bar, and one at a bus stop. And that was the type of attack I was concerned about, because up where we were the only American or white group up in that part of the country. There was one other white lady up there that was permanent, resident up there. We were the only group. At this side of the at the early part of the crisis, we did not know yet whether there was any anti-West sentiment. Where in this situation, we knew there wasn't. We knew we were completely out of the equation. It was just kind of stay low. Here, we didn't know whether anything, because it was known America was, the ones that funded the anti-terror unit. They're the ones that, provided training. Was there going to be any anti-American sentiment? And if there was, we were the only Americans up there, so we would be the target. And so with that one attack, we had to make the decision to pull out. And so nothing had happened up there yet, but we pulled them out. Actually, again, relocated them to Tanzania. We had them in Nairobi 24 hours after the attack, in Tanzania 48 hours later. So at 72 hours from the attack, they were already relocated to Tanzania, carrying on with their program. But it had a domino effect of having to pull our long-term people out because they were watching over them. And as we carried on, sure enough, it was only a matter of days before attacks started happening there in Garissa. I was charting every attack initially that was happening in Kenya on the map. Where it was happening, time of day, type of attack, casualty, all that sort of stuff, so that I could start watching the patterns. Because that's what I started learning, is that at the outset of a crisis like this, there's no pattern yet known. So you don't know what is and isn't going to happen. But it's amazing the patterns develop. And so we could watch and see the patterns, and we actually could see within the town of Garissa where attacks would and wouldn't happen. No attack happened before 7:20 p.m., which means everything happened after dark. Everything happened outside of a certain circle, which coincided with the exact circle where students were not allowed to go. And there was all this. So we waited actually 6 months. Things actually settled down. We thought everything was going back to normal. We went back, brought the students back in, and our long-term people. And we had one person actually that stayed in there through the whole time, one of our Kenyan staff. But then a few months later, all of a sudden, Jason sends me a text. I'm in church in Nairobi. And he didn't text, he called. And so I step out of church, and I said, yeah, Jason, what's up? And he says, I've just gotten a text from one of our students. They're all in different churches, and it's a Muslim area, but there are churches there, but all made up of people that come originally from the Nairobi side of the country, not indigenous to the area. And he says, I've just heard from one of our students that they got in their church. They said there's been an attack in a church. I don't know what's going on yet. He goes, but I have called every student. I've told, so all of them are accounted for. Our students are safe, and they're all leaving church and heading to my house right now. And I said, okay, well, find out what's going on and let me know. He called a friend. The first friend he called happened to be on the scene and there were 17. I think numbers weren't known yet, but 17 people were gunned down in the church, and hand grenades and multiple injuries. As gunmen came in, threw grenades, and then gunned people down as they were running out of the church. It was very incredibly brazen, incredibly horrific. Broke every pattern that had been there up to that point, and just was at this level that we, hadn't seen of any kind in the country up to that point, let alone just in Garissa. And so, as soon as we heard that level, that went way beyond trigger point, because now we were in a completely new category of situation. And again, we moved into the unknown, and we don't know now with that level of brazenness what's that going to mean now. So I said Nairobi. And so within about 2.5 to 3 hours of the first grenade being thrown, they actually attacked 2 churches, but one, they didn't do their surveillance right, and they weren't very successful. They threw one grenade that did go off but didn't hurt anybody. And the other actually landed by Jason's mechanic is Catholic, and it actually landed at his feet, but it was a dud and didn't go off. But the other churches where the mass, casualties and fatalities were. So within about 2.5 to 3 hours of that attack starting, our people were moving out of town and were heading towards Grissom. So they come down, and now we're in a situation. Okay, what do we do here? And again, it all comes down to information. So we get everybody settled. Jason and I go back up, and we again start meeting again with all the various security people, the anti-terror unit. By this time, there'd been a new guy in charge of the anti-terror. We actually became closer friends even with him. He was a believer. It was actually kind of on a side note. We meet with him in his office. We did over a period of months. We became quite close with him, and he would, after we finished talking about terrorism issues, he would ask us questions about how to disciple Muslim believers, former Muslim believers, because he had one living with him, a former Somali who was a former Muslim, and he's like trying to figure out how to disciple this guy. So it was a very interesting dynamic we'd have in the security office. But we went and we met with the pastors in town who were all dealing with funeral arrangements and hospital arrangements and all this sort of stuff. And then as we came through, we got all kind of an idea what was going on, and we really felt, okay, we got to keep the students out for a time. It was Ramadan. We had to keep them out for quite a time. But the situation actually allowed our long-term people to be able to go back in. Just there's enough dynamics that told us that was going to be okay, but not for our students. So, but we got back down to Nairobi, and we decided, it's been a bit of a stressful week, especially for the students. Tomorrow, why don't we go for a picnic after church and just go blow off some steam, kind of diffuse the stress a little bit. So we go for, I'm going to put the same date here because it's the same week. The year hasn't changed yet. And we go for a picnic just out on the edge of Nairobi, beautiful place, nice little lake. As we're leaving the picnic site, we have our whole team. There's 4 cars of people with kids and whatnot. My family, and we had Jason's wife Becca and their 2-month-old or 3-month-old baby. She hadn't been feeling well, Becca, so we were going to take her to she's going to stay at our house. Well, everyone else was going to a guest house somewhere. We're going to different places. Our car was last in line. And we're leaving the place, and we were a little bit far behind. My son, who was 16 at the time, was actually, he'd asked if he could drive to the main road. I said, sure, no problem. And we got separated from the other vehicles by gunmen who stepped out in front of us, stopped our vehicle, entered the vehicle, and then commandeered, put me upside down. They went through all our pockets, took all of our stuff. I was upside down behind the driver's seat for about the first half hour of the event. Slowly got myself turned right side up, so there's 2 guys in the front bucket seats and 1 guy on the bench, and then in the back seat was Becca with the baby and my oldest daughter, who's the middle child, and then our son and daughter and my wife were also on the bench in the middle. And too long to tell the whole story. It lasted about a 4-hour ordeal. They were wanting $150,000, in Kenya equivalent, Kenya shillings. I don't carry that on Sunday nights, so it was a little bit of a problem. And it took about 2 hours for them to get down to equivalent of about $90,000. And they had all sorts of ideas of how they were going to get this, and even they'd keep my wife and kids while I go home and get the money and bring it back to them. And all sorts of different situations. Of course, I wasn't going to leave my wife and kids. Through the whole time, I'm in a process of talking with them, and you get about 2 hours in, and at one point they had taken us way out into the bush. It was pitch black. We had no idea what was going to come out of that. We had just left. I just left a few days before the scene of a church massacre. My life was no more valuable than the lives of the believers that had just been lost at that church. I didn't know what was going to happen. It was just one of those scenarios. Yet at the same time, God's peace was there in a way that is indescribable. But as we came in about the 2-hour point, they picked up their gang leader. He was absolutely stone drunk. We picked him up at a bar. He was walked out carrying a whiskey bottle or something. I don't know liquor, so I don't know exactly what it was, but I could see in the headlights as he walked in front of the vehicle to get in, there's only about that much left in it. And he gets in the vehicle and he's very violent and he's hitting his guys and shouting, and takes control of the steering wheel and drives, and he's driving like an absolute maniac. And I'm like, okay, Lord, now the things have just gotten from bad to worse. And we'd all been praying nonstop, up to this point, quietly, for the most part. And at that point, I knew that, okay, one, he could kill us with his driving right there. Even his guys were scared. And two, if he doesn't do that, we got a drunken charge negotiation now, and that just never goes well. And I actually, literally, this is actual real. I prayed quietly and said, Lord, sober this guy up. Take control of his thoughts and take control of him. And within 2 minutes, he was completely sober. Like, driving nicely. And if he hit a pothole or a speed bump too hard, he'd turn around, oh, sorry, everybody okay? I mean, it was a complete change of demeanor on him. And then, but at that point, this is where when we compared notes later, myself, my wife, Nancy is my wife, Becca, and our oldest daughter, all around the same time, we all felt like we prayed all that we could pray. And nobody knew we were missing because the other vehicles were going to a different destination. And nobody knew where we were. Nobody knew we were missing. Nobody knew anything. And 2 hours in, I felt I prayed all I could pray. And I just felt like absolutely drained. And I remember praying, Lord, get other people praying for us. But I had no idea how was that going to happen. And found out later, like I say, the others were praying the exact same thing. God, get other people praying for us. Well, it was at about that time when Jason tried calling his wife, no answer. So tried me, no answer. Tried Nancy, tried my son, no answer. That's kind of weird. He leaves the kids with one of the other missionaries, their kids were already in bed anyway. He comes over to our house and we're not there. He knows instantly something has happened, so he starts calling, people start praying, word starts getting out. All the way over in America, it was Sunday morning, there were churches over here that started praying for us while we were still held. And it was at that point where we got over the hump and things started moving towards resolution. And too many details go into how it all resolved, but it resolved. And to the point of us getting out with our vehicle and our kids, and more importantly with our lives. And now, the aftermath of it was much longer than the actual incident. So that's terrorism, now crime. And then in the midst of all of that, the next year, our friend of ours who, and this is the part I'm not going to want on the, even though it's all over broadcast, I just don't want my name connected here online. But I'm going to tell you the story here. We can maybe hit that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So yeah, the first commonality of all these was the need for accurate information, and the difficulty of getting it. Any other characteristic? Yes, Emma.
Characteristics that we might need to help them with, you're saying?
Yeah, or just the characteristics of the situation itself. Just how is a civil unrest situation different from the terrorism? How's that difference from crime? They're all bad situations, but there's some distinctions in them that bring difference in how you help and what sort of help. So
the civil wasn't attacking them.
Right. We were not in the civil unrest, we were not in direct threat. We were in the middle of it, but it was around us, but it wasn't about us. So, that's a great point. Any other characteristics, and feel free to throw them for any of the four.
It seemed like there was a different degree of predictability. I mean,
Correct.
Some idea that something could go on. You probably figured you weren't going to be in the middle of it, but yet you were taking precautions. At the end of the day,
Yeah.
they could have been more. You've
Yeah.
done some shopping ahead of time or whatever, but at the end of the day, there was some predictability. Probably a lot of predictability in this one, or more at least.
Yeah.
And then no predictability in this
Correct.
one at all.
Correct.
So there's that
Yeah.
aspect of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the terrorism part, your defenses definitely had to be up.
Right. And that took preparation and planning. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, our defenses had to be up.
It occurs to me when you were talking about the information getting to Canada and back so
Yeah.
fast, that especially with civil unrest, that it's very important that the home front be able to assure the person who is there in the situation that they are a safe place to be able to share the information.
Yeah.
Because they probably need to talk and process and get information, but they need to know that nobody in their country is going to know they're asking any questions.
Right. Yeah. And that there's a lot of stuff packed into right there. And that the issue of, you reference processing, you reference the issue of, are you safe now?
Mm-hmm.
And that speaks to now, is the situation ongoing? Or is it, and that's with crisis management, the very first thing you want to do is contain the crisis. And so is the crisis, is it an ongoing scenario itself? And that changes. If the scenario is ongoing, what type of assistance is needed is very different than if the scenario is past. And now we're moving into, like, for example, the terrorism situation went on for 1.5 years. The civil unrest, but it wasn't as intense. But it became strangely normal to be sitting at Thanksgiving dinner and getting text messages that there's been a grenade attack in such and such a place, and then making the note on my map later in the evening. It just became strangely normal for that type of information to be moving. But it wasn't, it had intense moments, but it was prolonged. The civil unrest was incredibly intense over that 2 months. The hijacking was even more intense because now it was about us. But in the middle of it, nobody could help us because nobody even knew. It was a matter of prayer, and it was prayer that made the difference. And when I said about all those churches praying for us, that is really what made the difference. When that information came, but it was short, it was intense. But now, in terms of the impact on our family, you have the civil unrest that lasted 2 months. You have the terrorism that lasted about 1.5 years. Actually, it continued on beyond 2 years, because then we had the Westgate Mall attack in Nairobi. We were, we weren't at the mall. We used to shop there all the time. We lived right down the road from it, and we knew a lot of people that were inside. Didn't know anyone that was killed, but we had a lot of friends that had people that were killed inside that attack. You had impact on the whole psyche of the country, but. Then so that had an impact. Then the crime, was a very short event, but the impact. So in the aftermath, where do you think the longer impact was on us as a family?
The crime, because it was directed
Correct.
at you.
Exactly. It was directed at us. It was very intense, and the impact of walking through that was much more than the 4 hours of the incident itself.
Do you think the crime was related to the fact that you were from the West or Christian?
No. It's I hate to say it's incredibly common in.
Kind of random.
Yeah, we were in the wrong spot at the wrong time.
Because the first two things are really kind of more political. Right?
Yeah.
And then, the crime was sort of personal.
Yeah.
And the other could have been religious.
Yeah, the other was religious, and hard in the fact that it was a close friend lost. He lived right down the street from Beck and Jason. It was very close, but yet again we weren't in personal attack. As a side point, the pastor that was shot in that attack, the bullet came in his shoulder and came out his chest. He got airlifted to Nairobi, but amazingly never broke his rib cage. And I went to visit him. I happened to, just by luck of the draw, so to speak, I don't believe in luck, but I happened to be the first one to visit him in the hospital when he got to Nairobi, and I sat with him and his wife and a grown son for about 45 minutes. And then that was on a Friday morning. Sunday I came back with Nancy and the kids to visit him. And he's 72 hours out after being shot. He's all bandaged up. He's sitting on his bed, and there's a whole bunch of people around him. And he looks at my kids, and he goes, "Do you know what?" He goes, and this is a guy, he's not a Somali. The one that was killed was a Somali. He's another tribe, but had lived up in that area for 30-some years. And he goes, "Do you know what? I was shot by a Somali." And then he just kind of paused for quite a bit and let it just kind of hung there. Then he goes, "But you know what? I was also rescued by a Somali who took me to the hospital. That's why I love Somalis." That was, I'll never forget that, and how he said that to the kid 72 hours after being shot. I mean, it was like, but, sorry, that was a side tangent. You had a question back there.
Did you have access to an organization independent of yours that, besides you being in the situation, on ground level, we know you have something that would help in the extortion or crime situation?
Yeah, there's an organization called CCI.
Well, there's a number of them.
Yeah, and Crisis Consulting International is one that we have a connection with. That in the event that there was a sustained kidnapping, they would have been called into the situation. Yeah, and so there's several organizations. CCI gets involved in a lot of these situations in hostage negotiation.
I think that's critical.
Yeah, it is because there's always that point if it is, and that type of carjacking is now different than kidnapping. And for a political kidnapping or a, terrorism kidnapping or that, they're not wanting it to go on long. They're wanting to get in, get their money, whatever they can scrounge out of it and be gone. Where the others have a point to make and they can go on for weeks and weeks and weeks. But that outside organization coming in to work through that becomes very critical in those situations.
The professionals that deal with that are different are actually, it's harder to deal in the U.S. when we have drug-related, emotional, kidnap, ransom types of thing than it is professionals that want to do it again and again.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Do you think that, you mentioned here maybe that when you had broken protocol, that contributed to you guys being picked off sort of at the end of a convoy. Do you think that's a big part of it, or was that?
Which broken protocol?
Well, you said you'd kind of fallen behind.
Yeah, and that may not have been protocol so much, but where I broke protocol was we left about 15 minutes later than I normally would have, and the sun sets very fast in Kenya.
Okay.
And it goes from daylight to down because it's on the equator. It's just a matter of minutes. Yeah. And so because we'd gotten there late and everyone was finally feeling like they're relaxing, I allowed us to stay a few minutes later. As we were leaving, somebody came up and asked if they could borrow a tire wrench for their. They had a flat tire, they had a jack, but no wrench. So we gave him one. He went off and disappeared because his car was evidently out there. Came back, he says, "That doesn't fit. Do you have another one?" Later, we realized he was delaying us, and
Is that right?
Yeah, he delayed us a good 20 minutes,
Oh,
and that right there was the critical point. So, but again, it was the letting your guard down for a moment,
yeah.
I don't go back on that and beat myself up over it because that's another important thing, particularly when you're dealing with where you're having to do an evacuation, you're having to do this. If you've got your information and you make your decision for an evacuation and you make your decision there, it's very important that you know that you made the decision based on the information you had today. Mm-hmm. Now, a week later, you're going to have more information.
That's right.
And at that point, it becomes very easy to second guess either yourself or someone else to second guess you. Going, well, look what happened. Maybe you didn't need to do that evacuation and all the expense and all the trouble of that based on what actually happened. But the reality is, but based on the information we knew here, that's what we stand on.
Yeah.
Not whatever did or didn't transpire.
I think when you mention the information, it's important to make the decisions based on the information.
Correct.
And not the emotions.
Exactly. Yeah.
There'll be a lot of emotions.
Yeah.
They're not going to lead to correct decisions.
Exactly. And that's where that information and deciding what's information and what's rumor, and then making it based on the information. If you have no sources of information, and this is where the home office, or whether the church or whatever, finding out, do you have enough information? Do you have sources, and not one person? You need multiple sources of information that are different types of information. Do you have enough? If not, you need to go find them. How can we help you? And of course, from this side, it's very hard to help out there. But it's even sometimes that question. We had a scenario going on in another country, and just me asking them that question, they never thought about the fact there had been a coup, that they needed to get more information. So how do you? Okay, yeah, let's go get more information. And so it's just helping them to think through some of those things.
When you're in crisis, or in the terrorism phase there, you mentioned that takes preparation and planning.
Yeah.
How much of that do you do yourself, and how much do you rely on an organization like CCI to provide?
That's a great question. One part of that is training. So my wife and I, about 8 years before, had gone through a week-long training with CCI. And that training actually was, we look back, as we went through every one of these situations, that training became critical in the process. So training and having the planning ahead of time, CCI will not come in and do the planning for you. But they'll give you the resources, or other organizations that do this, there are other ones. They'll give you the resources to be able to go through a process to figure out how do we do our risk assessment, how do we figure out what our contingencies are. And on the one hand, it's like Dwight Eisenhower would say about battle plans. Plans are critical, but they become absolutely useless at the point the battle begins. And that's not the direct quote, but that's the essence. Because everything changes because reality kicks in. But having the plans become critical because being planned and prepared for one crisis actually helps you be prepared for something that actually is different. And it helps you even to tweak it. If you're in a situation where you're seeing the stuff coming, like we were in this one, we had some warning. So we were able to kind of, okay, what are we prepared for? Okay, here's the situation, it's changed now. How do we have to prepare? How do we have to... So a lot of that's that training, and it goes back to, I think we all probably remember where we were on September 11th, 2001, right? 24 hours before that, I was actually, I used to actually just joke that I was a hostage. Well, until I actually later became one. I was a simulated hostage in a SWAT team demonstration for a city council and bus company owners on what a SWAT team would do in the event that there was a hostage situation on a bus. So 24 hours before the towers went down, I was sitting in a bus in a simulated situation. Ahead of the demonstration, the commander of the SWAT team talked about how important training was. And he says, because he was having to show to the city council why all the money they were spending was actually relevant, because they go through a ton of rounds of ammunition and training and all the time and all of everything. And he says, all the training, what it does, he goes, when you go into the situation and chaos happens, the only thing you have to fall back on is your training. And you now react based off the training. If there's a void there, you have nothing to fall back onto but emotion or whatever, and you can't make a rational decision at that point. And so it's the same situation there, that so having some training and the preparation, it allowed us to really walk through things much more rationally than emotionally.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to know what's going on. I remember watching TV watching the Twin Towers. When the first airliner hit, everyone thought this is an accident. They were announcing it as an accident on TV, but when the second one was hit, they said, we're under attack.
Yeah. And actually one of my colleagues, she was in Manhattan when the towers went down. And she was saying that the word on the street, because there's no cell towers, everything, all communication shut down, and everything was all rumor at that point. And so the people in the midst of it had less information than people outside of it, because they had no idea that they were, rumors of atomic bombs about to be released and all sorts. I mean, she said it was absolute chaos because nobody knew what was going on, and there's no means of communication whatsoever. And that becomes now, back to that information piece.
So we don't have anything under the martyrdom, but that must have really affected you and your team.
Yeah.
And people back home could do things to either help or hinder you processing that. Can you speak to that?
Sure. A lot of what happened there was that our church and our sending agency, many people in there actually knew him, so there was a personal connection for some of them. But kicking in with prayer and sustained prayer for them, for the family, for us. But then also kicking in with practical means of, okay, let's raising some money, to be able to help them. And actually, some funds were raised to be able to help the widow and to help various things. And that was a very good healing thing. Similar to our carjacking, our church back home and also our head office, we lost little compared to what we could have lost. But it was still, when you added everything up, wedding rings and phones and cameras and money and ATM withdrawal, probably $2,000-$3,000 worth of stuff. But they sent us some money within days of that happening. But the money, well, that was helpful. But what it also signaled is they were with us. And that to know that they were with us was the critical thing. And I think at that point, when you're helping from the home front in the aftermath, one is, or in the midst of the crisis, okay, are you guys safe? That really becomes the first situation. But then, what do you need? And walking, and just those questions of where are you at? And like he said this morning, the guy in the plenary session, he had all those faces on the map, on the screen, and all of them could be stress, And I'm sure I was probably more like the top left with the smile on my face. I'm good, On one hand, I felt good, but at the same time, it's where, okay, how do you ask the question that's not going to presume anything, but also gets behind to the next level, without asking questions like, or telling like, okay, this is what you should have done. That's the worst thing. Like I was telling, about a week after the carjacking, we were out for lunch after church and bumped into a young missionary, and he'd been raised in Kenya, and his parents had been there for 40 years. They were still there. Bumped into them, and we'd never met the parents before, so he introduced us, and then he referenced the carjacking. He goes, "Yeah, we heard about that. Yeah, we didn't know who that was though." And then the guy, he's heard about the gun-toting, Bible-thumping Baptist preachers. He was one of them. He puts his foot up on the bench, and he's got a pistol underneath his pant leg, and he goes, "This is what you really should have had with you." And that was the last thing I wanted to hear, and I just kind of bit my tongue and went on. But there's realizing there's a lot that can be done from the home front, but at the same time, it's little compared to the situation itself. A lot of it is just people out there knowing that you're there and just asking the question, what can we do? But then asking some probing questions to see if there's the front or whether there is, down the road. And knowing the checking in. Like we said, the aftermath of each one of these was different, in terms of personal impact on us. And I think it's thinking about what are things like, 6 months down the road. What are things like 9 months down the road, depending on the severity of the impact on the people. And what can you do to offer help? Are you still doing okay? Are you getting you getting any flack? Are you getting any weird sense of when you think about the scenario? And I'm not a counselor, so I'm not going to go into how to ask those questions. But I think it's really knowing that being okay takes longer than surviving the situation, whatever that is. So,
unfortunately, our time's
our time is up. Yes.
My takeaway is be willing and be prepared to be mobilized. In prayer first and foremost, and in whatever acts of mercy and grace and healing we can provide. So thanks to everyone. We go to our final session.
To the chapel.
Right.
Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you.